So this month's seminar deals with one of my most favourite characters in history of chemistry, and that's Henry Enfield Roscoe. And you'll see in Peter's presentation why, because not least because of Bunsen burners and mice and toasted cheese, which I notice is going to be on the slide. So Peter studied chemistry and took a DPhil at the University of Oxford, then worked at the Open University and the Centre for the History of Chemistry in Philadelphia, and then was in charge of the chemistry collections at the Science Museum for 24 years until he retired in 2015. And he's now honorary research fellow at the Science Museum and also here at UCL, where I am. And his next book will be on the polymer revolution, to be published by the RSC, though he doesn't tell me when. And he's going to talk about Henry Enfield Roscoe, a campaigning chemist. Yes. Okay, over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much. And may I just say that the polymer revolution will appear roughly at the end of the year, all being well. Now here you can see the cover of the book that I've just published with Peter Reed, Henry Enfield Roscoe, a campaigning chemist, and that is the basis of my talk. I'll only be talking about a relatively small part of the whole book because in 20 minutes I can't possibly deal with all of it. It's been available in America since May, because it was published by OUP USA, not UK, and it apparently won't be available here until the end of July. So if you're wondering why you haven't seen it in your favourite bookshop, now you know. However, it will be fairly cheap at £33, although personally I think the paper is incredibly thin. Now, I begin with a question mark because I don't know who said it, but my interest in Roscoe was sparked off by a remark I read in the College Journal. I rather think it was in an essay review or something. But in 1870, the portly figure of Henry Enfield Roscoe could be seen running down a railway platform as he sought to connect the connecting train in his ongoing endeavour to link academia and industry. It's a striking vision, but I've been completely unable to find the original source. If anybody has any ideas where it appeared, I would be very pleased to hear from them. So that's just a plea for help. Now, my determination to write a biography of Roscoe might have faltered had it not been for the strong encouragement I received from the late John Pickstone at the University of Manchester, who believed that such a biography was essential and perhaps less wisely that I was the person to write it. However, the project really only took off in 2015 at a SHAC meeting, as it happened, when Peter Reed and I joined forces to write it. Peter brought his expertise in the history of the regulation of the chemical industry in the 19th century and his deep knowledge of Lancashire and in particular Liverpool from his previous employment at the National Museum of Merseyside to this project. Thank you, Peter, for being my co-author. Unfortunately, because of a prior engagement, he's unable to join us today. Before starting my talk, I would like to say something about the archive with you very briefly. Peter Reed had done most of his research at the John Rylands Library at the time of the pandemic, using both Roscoe papers and University of Manchester papers. But I was hindered because I had not, in fact, really started my research by the time the pandemic broke out. The correspondence to Roscoe in the RSC library, now available online at long last, so please all rush off to look at it, was surprisingly unhelpful to us, although it was certainly useful to Alan Rock when he did his work on atomic atomism as long ago as the 1960s. The most useful sources for my chapters were the letters between Harry Roscoe and his cousin Henry Devon, who was in Australia in the 1850s, working for the Royal Mint of Sydney. By the way, you can see a letter here from Roscoe, and I've really chosen it at random, and it shows what lovely handwriting Roscoe had. Unfortunately, Bunsen, who was his main correspondent, had terrible writing, and I've never been able to read it. But that said, the Bunsen-Roscoe correspondence is interesting, but not terribly useful. I might say that Devon had studied chemistry at UCL alongside Roscoe, and after working as an assayer in Australia, went into political economics, and he's now best known as a founder of modern economics. Now, because I only have 20 minutes or so, in fact, I'll be spending 30, so a bit longer than that. I will not be covering all the topics covered in our book, so I won't be dealing with his family background and early life. I won't be dealing with his education at UCL. I won't be dealing with the development of Owens College and Victoria University. I won't be dealing in any detail with the Samuelson Committee. I won't be dealing with the Vice-Chancellorship of the University of London or his role in founding Imperial College and the Science Museum. As it happens, many of these topics were actually covered by Peter Reed, not myself, but I'm showing the topics I will be talking about, which you can also see on this slide, mainly on the basis of what will be of interest to members of SHAC. Now, since I'm not going to be talking about him in any detail, here's a short life of Henry Enfield Roscoe for you. He was born in January 1833 in London. He was known as Harry rather than Henry because his father was Henry and he also had an older cousin called Henry. Unfortunately, his father died when he was 3 and the family moved back to Liverpool. Between 1848 and 1852, he read chemistry at UCL. In 1853 and up to 1857, he studied chemistry at Heidelberg under Bunsen and also worked with Bunsen. In 1857, he became professor of chemistry at what then was called Owens College, Manchester, effectively what is now the University of Manchester. In 1863, he married Lucy Potter, the daughter of Edmund Potter, a calico printer, an MP, and she's best known today, like everybody connected with her, for being the aunt of Beatrix Potter. Between 1881 and 1884, Roscoe served on the Samuelson Committee on the to investigate technical education. Shortly after that, almost by accident, he became MP for South Manchester. In those days, they tended to call it South Manchester rather than they would now Manchester South. In 1895, he lost his seat to a very eminent opponent. I'll come up to that later. And he then became Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, which at that time was not a teaching body. It was only an examining body. And it was during Roscoe's time as the Vice-Chancellor, but it became the University of London we know today, although it's obviously undergone many changes recently. Then he became chairman of the Lister Institute of Preventive Medicine in London. It was a very controversial period for the institute. And finally, in December 1915, just 3 weeks before his birthday, he died at his winter retreat at Roscoe, Surrey, of cardiac arrest. And that, in a nutshell, is the life of Henry Enfield Roscoe. And there's a nice picture of Henry Roscoe. And here we have a nice picture of Heidelberg. Because after taking his degree at UCL, Roscoe decided, like many other British chemists of this period, to go to Germany to study at Heidelberg, which was still suffering and still recovering from the turmoil of the Revolution of 1848 and its suppression by Prussia and Austria. In fact, when Roscoe arrived in 1853, the Prussian army had just moved out. He went to Heidelberg, of course, because of Robert Bunsen. Robert Bunsen carried out chemistry with close to physics on one side and inorganic chemistry on the other. It's a kind of chemistry that no longer really exists, perhaps only as physical chemistry. When Roscoe arrived in 1853, the laboratory was still in the former Dominican Friary. But 2 years later, in 1855, Roscoe and his students moved to a new laboratory building, which you can see here. Almost uniquely in this period, this building had piped gas and piped water and electricity via the water pipe from a central battery. So it was absolutely crucial, but he didn't try and hold the hot water tap and the cold water tap at the same time. But wastewater was still emptied into barrels, which had to be emptied overnight. But in this picture, notice the fairly newfangled bottle racks and especially the small burners. Bunsen made several inventions during his career, including the water aspirator. I prefer to call it the water pump, but apparently water aspirator is the correct term, and this bizarre-looking gas thermostat. However, his most important invention was the Bunsen burner, which he developed with the help of Roscoe and the physics laboratory technician Peter de Saga, on the basis of an argon lamp, and I'm not going to go into what an argon lamp is here, Roscoe brought back from London. The original burner, as shown in the picture here, used hose stoppered with corks, rather than the sleeve we all know today, which was introduced by John J. Griffin. While he was working with Williamson in 1856, Roscoe told Bunsen that everybody liked, and I quote, his little lamp, presumably because it was based on the argon lamp, and hence UCL may have been the first chemistry department to use them outside of Heidelberg, so congratulations to UCL. Here we have a drawing of a Bunsen burner by his niece Beatrix Potter in 1899, quoting from a textbook by Roscoe and his student Joseph Lunt, which I have a copy of, but we'll leave it at that for now. Now, after taking his PhD, which didn't involve any original research, Roscoe was asked by Bunsen to translate his new book on gas manipulation into English, with the cover of which we can see here, the front page rather, we can see here. Then Bunsen suggested that Roscoe carry out research on photochemistry, which was a field that Bunsen was just moving into. After an attempt to study the photochemistry of chlorine water failed, Roscoe switched to the study of the photochemical reaction between gaseous hydrogen and gaseous chlorine. The reaction is explosive in strong sunlight, but an equimolar mixture of hydrogen and chlorine is easily produced by electrolysis using the so-called Bunsen cell, and the products of the reaction are easily monitored. It's a very difficult reaction to study, not least because it serves an induction period, which we now know, but they didn't know, were caused by impurities. Bunsen and Roscoe were also overambitious and wanted to use the reaction to create an instrument to measure the chemical activity of light, because there was much interest in this period about what was the chemical activity of light compared with the physical manifestation of light, the so-called axionometer. And in fact, it's striking that the first workable axionometer wasn't made until 1956, which shows how difficult it was. Roscoe was able to state two fundamental principles of photochemistry, which are perhaps rather unfairly known as the Bunsen-Roscoe law. This picture here shows the so-called action spectrum for this reaction, with one peak about 400 nanometers and the other at about 380 nanometers, both of them being at the extreme violet end of the spectrum. Now, the two things I would like to say very quickly here, one is that they got it slightly wrong. In fact, the reaction takes place in the near ultraviolet, about 500 nanometers further on. But the other thing is to create this spectrum, to create this graph, and you can see the Fraunhofer lines along the bottom. To create this graph, they had to have a very solid understanding of the solar spectrum, and that is absolutely crucial. Just before he left Heidelberg in September 1856, Roscoe posed with the other members of August Kekule's social circle for one of the first group photographs ever taken by a professional photographer. Kekule is second on the right in the front row. Roscoe is fourth from the left in the back row, looking rather despondent because he's just about to leave Heidelberg, and his friend Lafayette, who's famous for his periodic table, is fifth in the row, the chap with the beard next to him. Now, after he left Heidelberg, Roscoe kept in touch with Bunsen and worked at Heidelberg in the summer vacations as well as taking holidays with Bunsen until his marriage in 1863. Here we see Roscoe on the right, with Bunsen sitting in the middle, and their colleague, the physicist Gustav Kirchhoff, during their visit to Britain in 1862 to see the international exhibition. Now, some years before that, in 1859, Bunsen and Kirchhoff had developed instrumentation for spectroanalysis. They didn't invent spectroanalysis, but they basically developed it into a technique. Kirchhoff then made the major discovery that the dark lines in the solar spectrum, which had been discovered in 1802 by William Hyde Wollaston, corresponded to the bright emission lines they were studying. Hence, armed with a spectroscope, anybody could find out the chemical composition of a star, something that the philosopher August Comte in 1835 had declared was impossible. Bunsen's earlier work with Roscoe on photochemistry was key to this breakthrough, because that work gave Bunsen a thorough understanding of the nature of the solar spectrum and the measurement of the solar spectrum, and also to prevent explosion while doing their reaction, they developed a heliometer which sends a narrow pencil of sunlight to the instrument, Both of these aspects were crucial to the development of spectroscopy. Bunsen had hastened to tell Roscoe about his breakthrough in a famous letter of November 1859, and here you can see the vast impossibility of reading Bunsen's handwriting. And in the following summer, Roscoe saw their apparatus for the first time and found it wonderful. In the same vacation, Roscoe persuaded Bunsen to attend the famous Carrefour conference to discuss atomic weight, although Bunsen hated going to conferences. Now, Roscoe became a missionary for Bunsen and Kirchhoff's work, thereby somewhat overlooking others who had some fair claim to have discovered spectroscopy, and gave a famous lecture on spectroscopy at the Friday evening discourse at the Royal Institution in March 1861. But that wasn't the end of it, because 7 years later, Roscoe gave a whole series of lectures on spectrum analysis at the Society of Apothecary in 1868. He gave much attention to the application of spectroscopy in astronomy, and especially solar astronomy, as shown by the colourful cover of the published version of the lectures, which, despite not really being suitable for that purpose, became a standard textbook on the subject. Now, in 1857, some years before all this, Roscoe replaced Edward Franklin as Professor of Chemistry at Owens College, Manchester, which had been founded in 1851. Franklin had set up a laboratory and former stables in the ground of a house in Key Street, where the college was based, but faced with low enrollment, he bailed out and went to St. Bart's Hospital in London. Roscoe was glad to get the post, as he was unable to apply for the professorship at King's College London, which came up a few months earlier, as he was a Unitarian, not an Anglican, something he denounced his cousin Stanley Dreven as humbug. Now here's a drawing of Owens College, as it was in Key Street, in the former home of Richard Cobden, the Free Trade campaigner. It now possesses its office quite close to the Manchester Museum of Science and Industry, and in fact I've visited it. I had a picture of Roscoe in 1860, wearing rather colourful trousers. And here's a drawing of the new buildings of Owens College, designed by the Unitarian architect Alfred Waterhouse, which were completed in 1873. The street was then called Oxford Street, but it was later renamed as it is today, Oxford Road. Now, part of this expansion of Owens College, Waterhouse, with Roscoe's help, designed a new chemistry laboratory building with two large laboratories, one being the quantitative analysis laboratory, which you can see here, and a lecture theatre able to hold no less than 380 students, but I have to say was vastly larger than the number of people taking chemistry at the time. It was based on Bunsen's laboratory building in Heidelberg, rather than, say, Hoffman's laboratory in Bonn or Berlin. It was firmly Heidelberg-based, and it was the model for several universities in the north of England, including, for example, Leeds and Newcastle. Waterhouse and his son went on to design several important laboratories, including the Dyson-Perrin laboratory in Oxford. Now, I'm going to pass over Carl Schlorlammer here because he's not really directly relevant to this talk, but he was replaced by Tom Thorpe, who had been working as a clerk in a warehouse before he became Roscoe's assistant in 1869. He was appointed the first government chemist in 1894, charged with overseeing the creation of a laboratory of a government chemist. When he was knighted for his service in 1909, he became third with Thorpe, despite having been called Tom all his life. Now, Thorpe worked with Roscoe on the chemistry of vanadium. In 1865, Roscoe visited the copper mines at Mottram near Alderley Edge in Cheshire, an area once famous for ICI pharmaceuticals and now the haunt of overpaid footballers, where he was presented with a bottle of a mysterious blue solution by the mine owner, who thought it would probably be cobalt. By contrast, Roscoe was able to show that this solution contained vanadium, found at Mottram in the form of your mottramite, which is a lead-copper vanadate. Vanadium had been studied by the famous Swedish chemist Jacob Berzelius in 1830. He believed that vanadium was related to chromium, which is not perhaps unfair if you look at the colour of vanadium pentoxide in its slide, and hence believed that the highest oxide was a trioxide, as if it were chromium. Roscoe later surmised that some of Berzelius' problems with vanadium have been caused by the presence of phosphorus, which is difficult to remove because of its chemical similarity to that metal. Roscoe, by contrast, was able to show that the highest oxide was actually a pentoxide, B2O5, shown here, and that vanadium chloride of Berzelius was actually vanadium oxychloride. Hence, vanadium was related to phosphorus and arsenic, not chromium. Bunsen corrected the atomic weight of vanadium. It's still roughly the same today, an important step for the periodic table, and with difficulty he isolated the free metal. He gave a prestigious Bakerian lecture at the Royal Society on the subject of vanadium in 1868. In the mid-1870s, Roscoe obtained a sample of columbite, now called columbite Fe, shown in the slide, from Greenland, and obtained niobium from it. Niobium was able to isolate the metal and also show that niobium trichloride, this rather inky looking powder here, unusually reacted with carbon dioxide to form niobium oxytrichloride and carbon monoxide. Through his work on these exotic metals, Roscoe did much to extend our understanding of the periodic table. Roscoe and his co-author Karl Scholema also promoted the periodic table in their massive treatise on chemistry. Now, in this group picture, you can see, in fact, was taken in 1887 when Dmitry Mendeleev came for the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. You can see on the front row, there's Nikolai Menshukhin, a Russian chemist who was associated with Mendeleev and Roscoe. In the back row, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, is the dye manufacturer Karl Martius, Thomas Carnelli, who was a graduate of Roscoe's school and who worked on the periodic table before his sad early death, Roscoe's friend from UCL, William Russell, who was later president of the Chemical Society, Karl Scholema himself, and at the very end, somewhat gate-crashing the event, I think, William Odlin, who also worked on the periodic table. And I can say this is the first time that all these people have been correctly identified. I showed that in an article I wrote last year. I'll probably be able to go now. Apart from his teaching at Owen, Roscoe had a major impact on chemistry through his textbook. To his frustration, the shortest and most elementary, the chemical primer, which you can see in this image here, was the most influential and most used, rather than his massive treatise on chemistry or his other textbooks. So, in 1885, I'm moving on a bit here, almost by accident, Roscoe became the Liberal MP for South Manchester. This was a huge departure, as Manchester had hitherto been a multi-member constituency. Although Manchester was a generally liberal city because of the importance of free trade for its industry, in 1885, the Irish Parliamentary Party was allied with the Conservatives very briefly, and hence Roscoe, as his niece Beatrix Potter pointed out in her journal, became the only Liberal MP in the city. In 1886 and in 1892, Roscoe had faced a Conservative candidate rather than a Liberal Unionist candidate, and won a bit narrowly on both occasions. But in 1895, for the first time, he had a Liberal Unionist against him, and not any Liberal Unionist, but the Marquis of Lorne, the heir to the Duke of Argyll, and more importantly, the first non-royal to marry into the royal family for nearly 400 years. As a result, he was also the former Governor-General of Canada. Nowadays, I'm sure it wouldn't be allowed, but in those days, he was able to stand as a candidate. Roscoe was tired of having to keep in touch with the constituency, having moved full-time to London in 1887, and the election happened to clash with his daughter's wedding. In truth, he was happy to lose to such an eminent opponent. Presumably, anyway. Now, soon after Roscoe became an MP, his party leader, William Gladstone, declared his support for Irish Home Rule. This meant that the Liberals had the support of the large Irish Parliamentary Party because, of course, all the Irish seats were then part of the UK Parliament. But nearly all the Whigs, that's the more right-wing, more traditional members of the Liberal Party, and even many radicals, left the Liberal Party to form the Liberal Unionist Party. The battles over Home Rule bills, which were invariably vetoed by the House of Lords, meant that Roscoe's concerns, such as the promotion of industry and constitutional reform, went largely unaddressed. Furthermore, the Liberals were out of power between 1886 and 1892, and a minority government between 1892 and 1895, which meant that Roscoe did not have much scope for influencing matters. Now, turning to Roscoe's activities as an MP, in May 1886, when he'd only been in Parliament for a few months, Roscoe's friend Edward Ryder Cook, seen here with a splendid beard, a soap maker in Bow, and the treasurer of the Society of Chemical Industry, founded by Roscoe, raised the problem of the atmosphere in the Common Chamber. A committee was set up to investigate the problem, and despite being a UMP, Roscoe was made the chairman, presumably because of his earlier work on ventilation in 1857. The solution he developed was to store the sewage from Parliament in vessels under the Speaker's garden, which was from time to time injected into the London sewers using a hydropneumatic ejector invented by the mining engineer Isaac Trone. And there's a wonderful article about this online if you want to look it up. Roscoe often sparred with George Gossen. Gossen was a liberal unionist of German descent who was Chancellor of the Exchequer between 1887 and 1892. There's a bit of a story of Randolph Churchill said, "Damn, I forgot Gossen," but I won't go into that now. One such occasion was in 1888, when Gossen wished to ban the use of saccharin, then an entirely novel product, in beer, on the ground that it allowed brewers to evade the duty on sugar. Roscoe defended saccharin as a possible new industry for Britain, and on the correct ground it would be difficult to detect at low levels. However, the ban was sustained until 1901, when an import duty was levied instead. Roscoe and his allies on the Liberal side of the House attempted 4 times to get a bill to promote technical education passed on the basis of the Samuelson report, of which, of course, he was a co-author. Roscoe himself did so twice, but all failed for lack of time because there were private members' bills. Eventually, the Conservative Lord President of Council, which in those days was effectively the Education Secretary, Garthorpe Hardy, Viscount Crumble, presented the government bill, which became the Technical Instruction Act of 1889. While it was not everything that Roscoe thought, he was content with it. And there's a long story about how the funding for this was provided by the whisky money. And we may ask what the hell is the whisky money, but I don't have time for that now. And here we see Roscoe looking rather splendid in late middle age, perhaps about 1890. Now, in 1895, Roscoe was chairman of a select committee on possible changes to the system of weights and measures. In July 1895, the committee recommended that the metric system should be legalized, made compulsory after a space of 2 years, and taught in schools. The advantages of a metric system seemed obvious to Roscoe. He argued, and I quote, "What Arabs in Tunis can easily learn, the British public should be able to comprehend." End of quote. Balfour, the Conservative, Arthur Balfour, on behalf of the incoming Conservative government, introduced a bill that made the use of the metric system legal, and it was taught in schools as a result of the Education Code of 1900, also an achievement of Balfour. However, the House of Commons refused to make the use of the metric system compulsory. Lord Belhaven and Denton and Lord Kelvin, who of course became an SI unit, introduced a new bill in 1904. In his speech for the second reading, Lord Belhaven referred to the report of Roscoe's Select Committee. The bill was passed, but metrication was delayed. Roscoe himself found the opposition to compulsory metrication baffling, and in his autobiography, he optimistically declared, and I quote, "We may thus hope that in spite of opposition, which no doubt will occur in the House of Commons, a measure will ere long be passed to make use of a metric system compulsory," which would, in retrospect, is perhaps surprising, but he thought that this would be done by the pressure of public opinion. In this period, Roscoe was concerned about outbreaks of cholera in Mecca. It was a major interest for him in the sort of early in 1890. Another medical topic that Roscoe raised in the Common was rabies. Rabies was hugely unimportant in Britain, but there had been an epidemic in 1884, and figures of death from rabies remained high. Roscoe was in favour of muzzling dogs, which was held against him in the election of 1892, and may be one reason for his low majority in that year. But his real interest in rabies lay with one of his scientific heroes, Louis Pasteur. Roscoe met him in the 1860s, but renewed their acquaintance when he visited Paris on behalf of the Summerson Commission in 1882. Pasteur's work fulfilled an important role for Roscoe by showing the value of chemistry for the public good. Roscoe found his work on fermentation, with its value for the brewing industry, impressive. But with the development of the rabies vaccine, his admirance for the French savant knew no bounds. To cut a long story short, and it is a long story, Roscoe and the famous physician Joseph Lister worked to set up a British counterpart to the Pasteur Institute to cure rabies, but also other diseases such as diphtheria as well. It sort of did reasonably well for about 20 years. But in 1914, after the Medical Research Committee, which of course was the forerunner of the Medical Research Council, was set up, a merger with the Lister Institute was proposed. Roscoe was in favour, but other members of the governing body were strongly opposed to the idea. At a crucial meeting in November 1914, Lord Moulton, chair of the MRC and about to become the explosive czar of the British war effort, spoke in favour of Roscoe, arguing, quote, "In scientific mind, abstract difficulties loom too large," end quote. The merger was narrowly defeated. What hurt Roscoe most was the attack by some of the members of the governing body of the Lister Institute on the very concepts of state-funded research, which Roscoe had fought to obtain for scientists all his adult life. The Medical Research Council then set up the National Institute for Medical Research, which was then based in Hampstead. The Lister Institute itself staggered on with the help of private funding until it was finally closed in 1978. The building where it was based on Chelsea Bridge is now a private hospital. Now, one little tidbit for you here. In 1911, the new King George V, whom Roscoe knew, reluctantly agreed to create up to 250 peers to push through the Parliament bill to abolish the veto of the House of Lords. If the Lords defeated the bill on the crucial vote on the 19th of August 1911, one of the hottest days of the 20th century. Roscoe was 13th on the list of proposed peers. Sir John Brunner, the chemical industrialist, was the first on that list, but thanks mainly to the bishop, the Lords gave way and the bill passed both houses and Roscoe never became a peer. It would have died with him because his son had died about 20 years earlier, but it would have been interesting to know what title he would have taken. Perhaps aware of his mortality after an attack of pneumonia, Roscoe started to write his life history, affair purely for his family and friends, or so he claimed, and was then persuaded to publish it with his usual publisher, Macmillan, in 1906. This is a book full of amusing anecdotes, which make it a much better read than most chemical autobiographies, which are really only suitable for an alternative to a sleeping pill. However, her research has shown that it can be quite unreliable. Most notably, for example, by a very famous story of a famous former student dismissed for cheating who was later hanged in America for cattle rustling. He did go to America and he did die in America, but he died of a stroke in Las Vegas, not having been hung for cattle rustling. So you do have to treat his autobiography with caution. Now, at long last, we come to the final slide, where I just want to sum up Roscoe's legacy. That legacy included the expansion of Owens College and the founding of Victoria University, which was the official name of the University of Manchester until it merged with UMIS in 2004. He played an important role in the reform of the University of London to once again make it a teaching body rather than an examining body. He played a crucial role in the establishment of the Lister Institute. He played a role in the establishment of Imperial College. He played a role in the establishment of a science museum as a freestanding body, separate from the V&A. He was crucial to the founding of the Chemical Society, the Society of Chemical Industry. He assisted in the formation of the forerunner of the Association for Science Education. He carried out important work on vanadium and niobium. He wrote influential textbooks from the primer to the treatise on chemistry. And perhaps above all, he played a crucial role in the promotion of reform of technical education in the country and its funding as well. Something that only finally came to fruition with the Robbins report of, I think it was 1964. However, we might also note that though he played an important role in all these achievements, in hardly any case, except maybe the Society for Chemical Industry, was his role paramount. He was not the protagonist in most of these things. You can argue about Owens College, you can argue about Victorian University, but in most of these things, he was one of a group of people who made these things possible. And this is part of the problem with Roscoe. His greatness only comes through when we consider his achievement together. So it's not just for his chemistry, it's not just for his administration of universities, it's not just for his attempt to reform education. It's only in his totality that his true greatness shines through. Thank you very much. Hello? Hello?
Hello, Peter. Frank, you're muted.
Yeah, I know. Just unmuting. Yeah, thank you, Peter. That was really, really interesting. I mean, you've, as I said at the beginning, Roscoe is one of my favourite characters, and you and Peter Reed have done him proud in your biography of him. Perhaps I can exercise my chair's usual prerogative and ask the first question, and that is about his autobiography, because there aren't many chemists who write an autobiography. I mean, I was just, when I was sort of thinking about this question, I think, well, who else has written an autobiography? And I mean, Lord Todd is one who springs to mind, but after that, I've run out of ideas. I'm sure there must be others, but I just can't think of them. And not only is it an autobiography, it's a highly entertaining, really well written autobiography to boot. So perhaps you could sort of say something about why Roscoe decided to write such an autobiography. Who did he think he was writing it for? Why did Macmillan publish it? Do we know how many copies were sold? That's those sorts of things. Because it really is an unusual production, especially with that sort of wonderful Beatrix Potter image of a mouse and Bunsen burner and toasted cheese and so on.
Yes. Okay, I'll try and deal with some of that. I'm not sure I can deal with all of it. Why did he write it? Well, he alleged that he wrote it in the first instance for his family and friends. And it's certainly in the sort of nature of whatever his after dinner talk, where you want to give some information, but you really also want to entertain the audience. Mm-hmm. So rather than sort of giving tremendously detailed accounts of his chemistry or even his political work, and I mean, he does give these details. His chief interest is giving amusing stories. But of course, if you focus on amusing stories, the truth may go slightly awry, because the truth may not be so amusing. Another problem is that I don't think he had any sources for his. He literally wrote it from memory. He didn't have a, as far as I'm aware, he did not have a diary. I say one of the problems we have was we did contact his family, but perhaps because of the influence of the one member of the family who's a chemist, they sort of rather broke off contact, which is a pity because they do seem to have had some papers which were interesting, including possibly a diary. But the biography, the autobiography, that gives every sign of having been written from memory. What's interesting is that when he's talking about people he knew in Heidelberg, he mentions some of the people in that photograph I showed. And I suspect he mentioned them because he had the photograph to hand. Right. So he's trying to be amusing. It's written from memory. He's not trying to he's not writing as a formal historian. So the result is obviously uneven. So we leave it at that. But there are details, but when you drill down into them, they're not quite as he present. I think he's also trying to make himself out to be more important than he was. Don't we all try to do that? And I think that why Macmillan? Well, he published all his books with Macmillan. He had a very close relationship with the Macmillan family. And I'm sure they said, oh, come on, Harry, you can't leave it to your family and friends. We want to put this out to the public. So I'm sure the publisher probably played a major role in getting it published. And maybe, with hindsight, that might have been a little bit unwise. You say, but it's a rarity. Well, it's a rarity in this country. I remember Lord Todd wrote a biography, and autobiography as well. But it's very common in Germany. I mean, one of the best autobiographies written in German, although thank God also available in English, was by Richard Wildstatter. And Richard Wildstatter's autobiography is also more than averagely interesting, but other chemists, mostly German chemists, wrote them as well. They were usually called Auf mein Leben, that means on my life, and they were usually incredibly tedious. This is the exception, but at the cost of historical accuracy. The numbers are here. I think I did at one point try to look into the Macmillan archives and with all the changes and what have you, but in the publishing industry, I'm not sure they're really available.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan.
Yes, that was excellent, Peter. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Time was very pressing, and so you rather skated over his role in filling out the periodic table, which many would regard as a sort of triumph of achievement. Would you tell us more about that?
Well, yes. I mean, he was one of the first people to take the periodic table seriously. For example, Borisov Forerunner, the Czech chemist, had gone to work with Bunsen because he wanted to flesh out the periodic table, particularly with regard to the rare earth. And Bunsen basically said to him, the periodic table is nonsense. Concentrate on doing something worthwhile. But Bunsen had a great dislike of theory. That was part of the issue. So he went to Manchester instead, and of course, Roscoe gave him every possible assistance, and he did do important work. Although he never discovered a rare earth as such, he certainly predicted the existence of some of them, and that was an important aspect. His student, Thomas Carnally, who was in that picture, he tried to sort of make mathematical laws out of the periodic table, which didn't really work very well, although of course other people have tried to do that as well, for example, with the density of metals. And of course, in his treatise of chemistry, he presents it, right square in the second volume, I think it is, of the treatise. He put forward the periodic table. He gives the history of the periodic table, giving credit to Yulin, for example, and of course his friend Lothair. And he says, this is an important part of inorganic chemistry. At a time when we're talking here about the mid-1870s, when, because as other authors have shown, it took quite some time for the periodic table to be taken seriously. But I think it was mostly the people who worked with him who did the paid work on that, rather than Roscoe himself. Although, of course, his work in vanadium was pretty crucial to it.
Okay.
Am I allowed a follow-up, Frank?
Go on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, was he approached about the commercial development of, for instance, vanadium, or was it just put out there as a scientific finding?
I think, I mean, he did do work with industry on other topics, for example, the development of a cast and counter process, for example. In the case of vanadium, I think he was satisfied to leave the others to draw on that. But of course, the whole point about the relationship between chemists and industry was very controversial at that time. So there's one of those cases where he puts it out and says, make what use of it you will. I mean, he worked on things like the cast and counter process came after he left Earn, and I think that's crucial.
Yeah. Thank you.
Right, I've got a bit of a queue coming along. So Judith next.
This is purely frivolous. At least it's fairly frivolous. Did he make a habit of employing Beatrix Potter as an illustrator?
No. I think Beatrix Potter just offered that drawing to him he wrote it in 1889, I'm not quite sure, because it was before he started producing his autobiography, even for family. He may have had some, I think he probably just did it as a present, really.
I see, so it was her initiative probably rather than his. Because quite a lot of women did get roped in as draftswomen.
Of course, you've got to recall, and we do say a little bit about this in the book, Roscoe did a lot to help her in her study of fungi. I mean,
yes, yes, I was interested in his employment of her. No, yes, thank you.
Okay. Andrew.
You did something in chat. I wasn't able to read it in the hurly-burly. What did he say?
Andrew there?
No, I can't see it, to be honest. Okay. Andrew, yes, Andrew did say something, but I'm not quite sure what. Hello, Andrew. Good to see you again. Is he muted? I think
you're muted. You're muted. Andrew, you're muted.
Put it in chat.
I'll read the question. I'll read Andrew's question out. The broad outlines of Roscoe's arc, especially from science to politics, seems to rhyme without a J.B. Duma. Both also spent early years abroad, Heidelberg in Roscoe's case and Switzerland in Duma's case. That's not really a question, but a comment. But perhaps you might like to comment on the comment, Peter.
So I think apparently the subtitle did not come across very well. Who was Andrew comparing him with?
Duma. Jean-Baptiste Duma.
Oh, that's a difficult one. Well, that's true. The comparison I would make would be with his friend Martin Berthelot. Because Berthelot became Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs briefly in the 1890s, and also was a member of the Senate, or the French Senate. And he was much more involved with politics than Roscoe ever was. Of course, the thing with Berthelot in particular was that he had a much bigger ideological and political agenda than Roscoe did. Roscoe never actually tried to sort of have an agenda. It steps into power as reform and technical education.
I mean, it's not actually that unusual in Britain in the 19th century for scientific figures like Roscoe to become members of Parliament. I mean, Roden Jackson, in his newish book on scientific advice to the British state, lists about 140 fellows of the Royal Society of London who were also MPs. I mean, it's not what Roscoe did is not that unusual. I mean, it's unusual now, and I mean, people make a great deal of fuss from the baby of the House of Commons, who's finished a natural sciences degree in Cambridge about 2 years ago, and is now an MP age 22. But in the 19th century, it happens quite frequently.
Well, indeed, the fairly recent Deputy Prime Minister, whose name is taken out of my head, you know, the one who was also Secretary of State for the Environment for a while, she took a PhD in niobium chemistry at the University of London.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure Roscoe would have enjoyed reading, if not perhaps the politics.
Absolutely. I've got a couple more questions, but if anybody else has a question, do put your hand up or put it in the chat box. Why was Roscoe knighted? What did he do specifically to, and which prime minister authorized the knighthood?
Sorry, what was that question again? Which prime minister?
Why was Roscoe knighted? Which prime minister decided to do that would be a good idea?
That's quite straightforward. He was given a knighthood for his service on the Summerson Committee, so he got it in 1884. He was given it by Gladstone, but to be honest, who the Prime Minister was almost irrelevant, because he was giving it for his work on the Summerson Committee. Any Prime Minister of the day would have done that. However, there is a twist in the tale here, and that is the following year, he was President of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And in those far-off days, I'm not sure it's still the case now, if you were President of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, you were knighted. So if he hadn't been knighted for the Summerson Committee, a year later, he would have been knighted for being President of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, something that he himself recognised in his autobiography.
Okay. Right. So my next question is another historiographical one. Roscoe spent a lot of time working on John Dalton, and I mean he actually publishes manuscripts of Dalton's that no longer survive because of the Blitz.
That's not true. Sorry, that's not true. The document still exists. It was
Still some
put on
document.
time, but they don't. But they were recovered in 1991, and it's in the Royal Library. Badly burnt, but they do exist.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. But so was Roscoe just being very pro-Manchester, looking at sort of his precursors of chemistry in Manchester, or is there something else like sort of supporting Daltonian atoms going on when Roscoe is writing that biography of Dalton?
Yes. Roscoe, in Manchester terms especially, I mean, Roscoe adored Faraday, he adored Pasteur, but in Manchester terms, he had two great heroes. One was James Joule. I insist it had to be pronounced Joule, not Jules. One was James Joule, and the other is Dalton. So Dalton for him was a great hero. He tried to show that Dalton had arrived at the atomic theory not by the pathway that had hitherto been assumed, namely the law of multiple proportion, but because of his work in gases. This is largely the case, but more recent scholars like a certain Arnold Thackeray I could mention have tended to take a broader view of the whole thing and try to avoid pigeonholing Dalton as doing one thing or another. The fact of the matter is that Dalton rather muddled his way through to his theory, and to try and put him in one philosophical school or the other, or to give one reason or the other for why he came up with it, is probably oversimplifying the whole thing, which Roscoe did not know, because Roscoe was obviously working as a scientist essentially rather than a modern historian of science.
Okay. Any more questions, comments? Anything in the YouTube chat box, Rob?
No, there's not, Frank.
Okay. Well, in that case, I will bring the seminar to an end. Just to say the next seminar will be on the 26th of September and publicised through the usual routes. And on the 11th of October, we have the SHAC autumn one-day meeting, which will be on alchemy, Freemasonry, Hermeticism, and Rosicrucianism at the University of Amsterdam. And Stephen Klukas will be delivering the keynote address there. The call for papers has gone out. I sent a reminder around this morning, and you've got another 11 days if you want to participate in that. Seminars like this don't happen because we happen to press the right buttons at the right time. There's quite a large production team behind these seminars, and I sort of like to thank particularly Rob Johnson, Anna Simmons, Becky Martin, and Joe Hedison for putting everything together. But above all, I would like to thank Peter Morris for writing the first biography of Roscoe in nearly 100 years following his autobiography, more than 100 years following his autobiography, and it is as good a read as the original autobiography. So thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone. Enjoy yourselves wherever you are in the world.
Okay, thank you.